Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session. My name is Ensa Yiannopoulos. I'm a principal analyst at Forrester. For those of you who don't know, Forrester provides research and advisory services to companies worldwide on topics that have to do with technology and business. And security, risk, and privacy is part of the topics that we cover. I spent the last 10, 11 years of my career looking into privacy and trust. I develop research and help companies on these two topics. And well, I'm very happy to be here. This is the very first time that I come to this conference. It's the first time that I speak at this conference, so I am very excited. And I'm here to talk about employee privacy. Now, I am so thrilled to see so many of you in the room for a discussion about privacy because, well, there was a time where privacy wasn't this cool. I remember if I tried to talk to a CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, or someone in their teams about privacy, like, hey, what are you doing for your privacy program? I would get, as a response, something like, attention, you have dialed an incorrect number. Please check and try again. Now, if I was lucky, they would send me to talk to the legal counsel or to a compliance officer. This until something happened. And things have changed. They've changed a lot since then. This was when, in 2016, the European Union passed a General Data Protection Regulation. That was a really big change. And I remember I've done a lot of work with clients around GDPR implementation, and I used to describe that time as, I used to describe GDPR really as a sort of Copernican revolution. Basically, the Copernican revolution that put the sun at the center of the solar system was a turning point for science. And similarly, in my mind, GDPR then put data subjects at the center of the privacy legislation was a little bit of a turning point in the world of privacy. And the shift that we went through as an industry, but also as consumers, and now we are going to have it as employees, was a very significant shift. There were a few things that I started tracking as part of my research to really show the difference that GDPR was making to normal consumers. You can see there, it was just shortly after GDPR started to be enforced, the regulator reported a number of consumers reaching out to their websites and filling up complaints forms. Companies weren't doing the right things with their data. And it was surprising. Consumers would take the time to go to a website of a regulator and say, hey, that company, look for them. They are not doing things right. And while these headlines were helpful, I can tell you that also on a personal level, I realized quickly how things were changing. And I'm going to tell you a story that some of my colleagues may know already, but as I said, 2018, a lot of work around GDPR implementation, so my days were filled with those kind of conversations. And at the same time, I have a small family. My son, my husband, and myself, we moved to a village in the south of London in the UK. We didn't know anybody at that time. And so the local church organized a sort of get-together to meet people in the community. And I thought, well, it might be a good idea to go. We can have fun. We can meet people that we don't know. And it was a sunny day in London, one of those days that you don't get that frequently. So I said, it's nice, let's go. And so we are there. I'm standing there with other parents. They're all talking about kids and schools and nursery, all that kind of stuff. And from a distance, I see the priest carrying a huge box. And he was approaching. And I'm like, right, this is a fundraising event. They are going to ask us for money. This is why we are here. And he's approaching, and I'm thinking, I don't have cash now. What am I going to do? And then he's there standing next to me with a bunch of envelopes in his hands. And he started giving these envelopes to everybody in this circle. And there he goes. hey, these are my GDPR consent form for the church newsletter. Make sure you read them, you sign them, and you give them back to me, because it has been so tough to understand which data I have, to whom I have to ask consent, to whom I have to send the newsletter. And I'm in a sort of shock. Is that really happening? And I look at these parents, again, normal consumers, and they are talking about how these requirements will clean up their inbox, and how they are gonna say, hey, I wanna be forgotten if a company is gonna give a bad experience to me. And again, and I try to pinch myself, is that a nightmare? But I cannot tell if I wanted to cry or if I wanted to laugh, but certainly that episode showed me that this GDPR was being very powerful in changing the way people were thinking about their data. And data, in fact, those are the GDPR form from the church. Data, in fact, is going to show us, and I brought with me the latest data that we have on Disa Forrester, but we have been tracking this for a long time, and the trend is there. Consumers understand their privacy rights. 60% in the UK say that they know that they can ask companies for data that they have collected about them. 57% of my fellow Italians say that they are familiar with a right, then say, I don't want to be profiled for marketing. And 54% of German adults will say that they are familiar with the right to be forgotten. They are familiar. Are they using these rights? Well, some consumers are using these rights. Now, the data that you see here says that these consumers have 31%, again, Italians, they have at least once asked companies not to be profiled for marketing, so taking action to say, I don't want to be profiled. And again, this is those that have done it at least once. You can imagine that they might have done multiple times. Almost 20% in the UK, they have asked for a data access request, and 23% in Germany have asked to be forgotten. Now you're thinking, but these are Europeans. You want to see what is going on here? I have data from California. 47% adults in California have exercised their CCPA right to ask companies to stop selling their data. Now, 47%. When I saw the number, I was surprised. It's high. And we are predicting at Forrester that by the end of this year, that number is going to go up to 70–75%. So we are seeing a lot of activity also in the US. And 30% of online adults in California have asked companies to be forgotten. So it's not just Europe, it's also California. As you can see, consumers are taking actions on their privacy rights. And it's not even only consumers. Regulators are also pretty active. This is data from the United Nations that says that 137 countries out of 194 have put in place legislation to secure, for the protection of data privacy. My own research tracked more than 120 countries. So clearly, this is becoming, in fact, a global trend. Privacy has gone global. For this presentation, I thought to share with you just quickly a list of some of the privacy legislation that have emerged after the GDPR, of course, the CCPA, the CPRA, now also in California, Virginia, Colorado, Utah, Connecticut, Iowa, and then Brazil, of course, and also some of the regulation that is upcoming, Australia, India, and Canada. These are countries that are refreshing existing rules or completely redesigning their privacy frameworks. Now, if you have to look at so many different privacy legislations, one thing that I always do is to look for common requirements, so things that you will find over and over again. And before I go there, I prepared this slide so that really looking at the legislation specifically in the US, and I put there the dates where the legislation is going to be, be formally adopted, and you see the CPRA there, January 2023, and also some of the dates where this new legislation is going to be adopted. The last one is Iowa in January 1st, 2025. And now I can tell you the kind of common requirements that I look at So to make sense of so much new legislation. So the common requirements are definitely consent, asking consumers and now employees about their personal data. And this comes in very different forms, as you see there. Data subject rights, consumer rights. We have seen the data from consumers asking, I want to know the data that a company has collected about me. I want to ask to be forgotten. Privacy risk assessment, accountability mechanism, making sure their organization can demonstrate that they are following the rules and they are taking accountability for what they are doing. International data transfer, third-party risk, breach notification. I know in the US you have a number of these kind of requirements. And then, as the Romans used to say, dulcis in fundo, you have employee privacy, which is really the topic that we are going to dive in today. It's time for employee privacy. This is a sort of timeline that I have put together because to track what happens with employee privacy here in the US can be a little confusing. So the first requirements around employee privacy were introduced by the CCPA first. But those requirements were kind of frozen. Then the CPRA came about, and the CPRA did two things. One was to expand the employee privacy legislation that was already in the CCPA, and also ended fundamentally the exemption that was in the CCPA. So in substance, on 1st of July 2023, the regulators in the US will be able to enforce rules on employee privacy as they are contained in the CPRA. What does it mean that employees in the workplace will have privacy rights? Which kind of rights are these? I made a list of these rights. You will see it's very similar to what we have looked at for consumers. Fundamentally, it's extending those consumer rights to employees in the workplace. It means that employees will have a right to access their personal information, so a process will have to exist for them to say, hey, I want to know which data you have collected about me over time. They also will have a right to correct. They can ask employer to change and update information about them. A right to deletion. This is particularly important because, of course, there are a number of requirements, compliance with other regulation, taxes, pension, all that kind of stuff that, of course, applies, but still employees will have an opportunity to say, I want you to delete some of the personal information that you have collected about me over time. There is a right to opt out from the sale of the selling or the sharing on their personal data, and this is particularly important because in the CPRA, the definition of sharing has been expanded significantly, so much so that fundamentally most data sharing that happens for monetary and non-monetary considerations falls within the scope of those rules. So we are looking at a lot of those processing activities that involve sharing of data. They have a right to data portability, and also they have a right to limit the use of sensitive personal data. Again, this is CPRA coming in here to bring a new category of data, to expand on it, sensitive personal data. And in fact, in the CPRA for consumer, there are a number of requirements that apply to their sensitive personal data. And similarly, they will apply to employees in the context of employment. And they also have the right to exercise their rights without any sort of retaliation from their employers, of course. It's not just the rights that employees will have moving forwards in the workplace. There are also other obligations for employers. One of these is their ability to write privacy notices. And this is for job applicants, for contractors, employees, and this is important. In the frameworks, in the data framework that I will present later, you will see that it's very important to employees to be told, this is the data we are collecting about you, this is why we are collecting it, this is how long we are going to keep it. And so this communication, this privacy communication, is really, really important, not just in the context of compliance, but also is what most employees really are expecting. So what are you gonna include in these privacy notices? I have just prepared a few things that should be there. The type of data that you are collecting, is sensitive data, is personal data, which kind of data it is that you are taking from employees. Are you gonna sell or share this personal data? How long are you gonna keep that personal data for, data retention? And also, who is collecting the data? Is someone, a team internally that is gonna collect and process the data? Are you planning to use an external partners to do that? Why you are collecting? Fair enough, what are you gonna do with that data? If you are selling or sharing, why are you selling or sharing that data? And the third element that we need to keep in mind as we prepare for employee privacy is around contracts, especially in the context of sharing that data with third parties. Maybe, I have examples there. It might be a HR tool provider, might be a recruitment agency, might be a software for employee monitoring. So every single time you're entering into an agreement with a third party where there is a sharing of these employee data, you will need to also refresh those contracts to account for these new privacy requirements. So what do you put in these contracts now? Well, you might want to specify the purpose of that data processing and data sharing. You will have to include some specific limitation, and this is very important. We got a sense of this from the Sephora case under CCPA already. That was consumer, but here is going to be exactly a similar concept where if you are working with a third party, you will have to tell them, this is the data that you need to use for this specific purpose. You cannot go beyond that. Missing the introduction of this sort of limitation is going to be a problem. You need to be much more explicit on what this third party can do with the data, what they cannot do with that data. You might include a prohibition to further sell or share that data as well. And then you are looking at a number of different clauses for a breach notification, for the employee rights fulfillment and notification as well. If you are passing that request to a third party, they will need to have a way to say, yes, we have seen, you're asking us to delete that data. Clauses also about the third-party CPRA compliance. We have seen so much going on already with the GDPR, with the CCPA, where you want to know your third parties are prepared or not for privacy compliance. What are they doing? So there is a lot coming for employees' privacy. There are a lot of new requirements, a lot of things that you will have to prepare for. And yeah, I am not kidding. I know that some of you might be still a little bit skeptical, might still be, is this really a thing? Is this really gonna happen? Are regulators really gonna look at what is going on in my company with employee data? The best way, I think, to respond to this question is to look at some of the activity that regulators in countries where employee privacy is already in existence have been doing over time. And for that, I went back to Europe. And of course, the GDPR contains a number of requirements for employee privacy. And are regulators actually looking into that? Are they enforcing the rules? Well, this list is about the 5 sectors where regulators have been particularly active. The list is made on the base of the total amount of fines so far levied in that specific sector. You can see number 4 there, it is employment, and is about 50 million euros in total. Now, in a place where regulators are not necessarily being particularly ready to use hefty fines that they still could do, but they are a little bit on the shy side, if you like. To see that amount of money in the employment context is definitely an indication that they are taking that very seriously. And it's not just regulators either. We, in fact, look at what companies are doing. The data that you see now on the screen is data that we have collected very recently as part of our privacy survey. We have asked over 2,000 privacy decision makers around the world to tell us which of the following initiatives are likely to be their top tactical privacy priorities over the next 12 months. And you can see that in number 4, 33% are saying that improving employee privacy communication is definitely one of their critical priorities. This is global data. What do you think the number is going to be if I look at US specifically? Is that going to be higher? Is going to be a lower number? Lower. That's what I thought as well, but no, it's up to 40%. So a US sample of companies said that improving employee privacy communication, 40% of them is part of their tactical privacy priorities for the next 12 months. So there is a lot of activity already happening. And actually, this is a good moment also to make the point that, of course, if one looks at the CPRA, might say, well, this is really California then. But we know, because we have seen what happened with the CCPA, that some things that start in California actually very quickly become then common and introduced in other states. And also I have seen from my work with clients that many would say, if I'm doing that for California, since I really believe it's the right thing to do, I might start also providing this opportunity to better privacy to employees in other countries, in other states. So this kind of work is already happening and is happening beyond California. So if you made it to this part of my speech still awake, congratulations and welcome to the National Geographic section of my presentation, which is also my best practices section. So the very first one, when it comes to the best practices is the definition of what's employee personal data, what's personal data. It seemed to be an obvious question, but I can tell you, very often we forget to start from the very obvious question. Before I dive more into employee data and the definition of it, let me tell you about the beautiful picture that I have there. This is a frigate bird, is a seabird that can be found in tropical and subtropical oceans. The image that you see is a male that during the breeding season inflates this distinctive red jugular pouch to attract females. Now, I am sure that you have never thought about the definition of personal data in these terms, but I can tell you confidently that if you were to look at what happened to the definition of personal data across privacy regulations over time, you would agree with me that to that definition happened exactly the same thing that happened to that jugular pouch. It has become bigger and larger over time. And so if in the past was just this very small set of PII we were looking at, now as more regulation came out, the list of examples of what is personal data has been just growing and growing. And so just for simplicity here is really about thinking any direct or indirect personal or household identifiers that an employer collects, stores, and controls. Is really a lot of data. I know that in the past we were thinking about personal identifiable information like this small set of data that we had to take care of. That has become a much larger basket today. And this is why I say it's very important to start from the question of what's in scope? What do I have to protect? What do I have to take care of? My second best practice is really to do with prioritizing unstructured data. And this is data classification and data discovery that we need to run to really identify where data is and to classify that data. I say prioritize unstructured data because in my experience, especially with consumers' privacy, we have been trying to prioritize structured data. It is easier in a way. But this is a very different exercise because employee personal information is often contained in performance review, conversations over instant messaging, resumes, things of that nature, so very much unstructured in nature. And then there is one other thing that as an industry, we have to do differently for privacy when we really think about discovery and classification, which is open the box. It's not enough to find a box, put a label on it, and think, okay, I have classified this, I know what's inside. For privacy, you really need to open the box because you need to see exactly whose data is there. And you need to be very accurate on the kind of classification that you are gonna do. And one more thing, to understand the risk of any specific data type and data point that you have, you really need to understand the business context. There are situations when a piece of data in itself is not risky at all, but in the context of certain processing activities, when that data becomes part of a larger set, that can become quickly toxic data. And so for privacy, it is very important that we open the box, that we understand the context of the processing activity, and we define risk to the data that takes into account the specific business risks. And then, well, you will have to look in very unusual data repository. Again, if I think about consumer privacy, many companies said, you know, it's really CRM that I'm going to look into, is really CRM that I'm going to focus on to make sure that I know which consumers data I have. With employees, it's very, very different because, again, it's about emails, instant messaging, formal documents, shared files. And I think that we learned that in Europe the hard way. One of the first companies that received a fine for employee privacy violation was H&M, the fashion retailer. And they received a very large fine because they didn't, I want to say they didn't realize that there was so much personal data of employees in informal documents on SharePoint. So a manager would have a conversation with an employee, they would record the notes about holidays, or maybe an employee wasn't feeling very well, other employees were going through some life events. But they never thought that when they did discovery and classification, all those locations needed to be taken into account. And so the regulator said that there was a disproportionate amount of data the company kept on all those kind of systems. And also, they had some serious issue with retention, data retention. And that is my next best practice because the retention of data is something that regulators are looking at in way more details than they did in the past. They would look at the schedules, they would look also at some of the controls that may be in place to actually then enforce those data retention policies. But data retention in the context of privacy is also very important, not just because regulators might be looking and might be asking those questions, but also because I have said in the context of data deletion, for example, when someone wants to be forgotten, the very starting point is to determine which data I, as an employer, cannot delete. And there is plenty there, data that you might need because there is ongoing contracts that you cannot just remove data from, or because of taxation, or because of pensions, or all kinds of different compliance requirements that you might need to comply with as an employer. So starting from the definition of data retention is going to then give you the opportunity to focus on the data that really potentially could be deleted. And so it's a very, very important point, both for employees' privacy, also for consumer privacy. If you haven't done this before, starting from the retention policy is going to make your life much easier whenever someone asks for access or for deletion. And so it's a very good practice to really define strong retention policies. And then the last of my best practices is another beautiful fish. Do you know what that fish is? It's a cleaner fish. And is one of the best examples of this collaborative behavior. So this fish, for feeding purposes, fundamentally cleans up other fishes. So they eat dead cells or infected tissues. And so they remove all of that from other fishes for their own survival, but this is really a win-win situation. And so we have to become a little bit like this cleaner fish in the sense that we really have just to be better at cleaning up And whenever we don't need the data, it's time to let that data go on one side. But it's also a little bit of a different mindset. We have to start learning that we collect only what we need to collect. This is data minimization, and it's going to help a lot of the activity that we run, including also the potential risk of exposing third-party data, maybe another employee's data, when you are replying to a data access request. And so being very disciplined on keeping only what you need is definitely going to help you out on a number of different activities. I said that was the end of my National Geographic section, also the end of my best practices session, and there is here a very important point to be made, which is all of this is for compliance, right? We are talking about employee privacy because these new requirements are going to be enforced and companies need to prepare for it. But employees is a very, very sensitive, a conversation about employees is a very, very sensitive conversation in the fact that it's not just compliance, is something else, it's something that goes beyond compliance. And here I want to share some of the research that we have done in the context of trust. In 2021 at Forrester, we launched a very critical stream of research about trust. And our aim was really to understand some of the elements that would influence the way consumers, partners, and employees think about when they have to trust a company. So which are the elements that really come to the front when trust takes shape? It's a very important question, and we wanted to be very practical in the kind of answers we were giving our clients. And so we did a lot of qualitative and quantitative research. We filled some surveys specifically for these. And when it comes to employee trust, it became extremely evident that undermining employee privacy clearly had an effect on degrading trust. In fact, we have asked employees, if you learned that your employer collected your personal information without your knowledge or without your consent, what would you do? How would you feel? You see that 31%, I would lose trust in my employer. And the rest of the descriptions there are pretty negative outcomes. So the fact that you are taking data from these employees without letting them know, it's something that really has a negative outcome on them. And the way I read these charts is really looking at the 6% there at the bottom, because only 6% of these employees would be indifferent if their employer had collected their personal information without their knowledge or consent. It's a pretty small number. Everybody else would take it pretty negatively. They don't like that. And these are some of the outcomes that you achieve when you invest on increasing or decreasing trust. This also comes from our trust imperative research. And of course, you have things that are like reputation of the brand and retention of employees, the ability to attract new talents, the ability to innovate. Employees that trust their employers are much more interested in trying out new things and helping their employers bring to market new things. But here's something else that we found as part of the research. I said that we ran a number of surveys. In particular, we have trust surveys that we run on over 13 countries. And one of the goals of the survey was to find a correlation between certain trust drivers and trust. So we wanted to know, we thought these are some key trust drivers. How do they correlate to trust? And I know that you are trying to read all of the 7 Forrester levels of trust. But I tell you that when it comes to employee trust, there is one, and only one, that is really, really important. Which one do you think it is? That is really important to shape employee trust. Which one, anybody? Who said empathy? Well done. Empathy is a key levels of trust when it comes to employees' trust. And This is also a very important part of the discussion. This is a regression model that we run on the survey and the data we collected. Now, if you have ever looked into trust, you know that local culture is extremely important in really shaping how people trust. And here, you can see across these 5 countries that I have taken as a sample, but across the different countries, whenever we looked at the specific levels of trust that were particularly important to employees, empathy always came number 1 or number 2 across countries. So if you have to think about an approach for your employees, think about empathy if you really want to build and maintain trust. And so I think that for us, as a privacy and security industry, the next step is not only to think about compliance, but also how do I build a privacy program that complies with the rules, but also allow me to build those empathetic relationships with my employees. And this is what we are going to do for the last section of my session. So to really develop an empathetic approach to your employees' privacy, we need to understand attitudes and behaviors. It's not a black or white. It happens often with privacy. It's not a binary thing. So we decided to create a segmentation. We call it the Forrester Employee Privacy Segmentation, to allow us to understand which kind of attitudes and which kind of behaviors employees have around their personal information. We use these 4 specific elements to build the segmentation: the willingness to share personal data beyond what's required by law, the awareness of data processing happening in the workplace, the comfort with existing privacy policies in the workplace, and also the ability of an employee to use technology and adopt behaviors that actually help limit the amount of data they would be sharing with the employer. And on this segmentation, we have identified 5 different groups. 3 of these groups are willing to share personal data with an employer beyond what's required by their contract. And then there are 2 groups that really don't like to do that. I'm going to allow you to meet them one by one. The complacent employees. They said, oh yes, privacy is important, but they do really nothing to protect their privacy in the workplace. They are not really worried if you're going to share their data with a third party. They are pretty chill. Privacy cooperative employees. These employees say that privacy is important to them. They know the policies that are at work to protect their privacy, and they feel that that is enough. They feel comfortable with the level of protection they receive. They say that they are happy to share their data with the employer, but they want the employer to let them know. So that privacy notices piece, it is very important for these employees. And so it's really that building the trust relationship with them. The controller employees, they are very concerned about privacy. They understand that there is data processing happening in the workplace, and they adopt behaviors and technology to limit the amount of data they share with their employers. So they are concerned, still willing to share their personal data if you ask them, but that has to be made very clear to them that you are collecting data for whatever purpose you are collecting data from. And then confused employees, they don't like to share personal data. They know that that might be bad. They are scared, but they don't know exactly what happens when data is collected. They don't know how to protect themselves. So they are really confused. They are scared, and this is why they don't want to share their personal information. And then you have these tough ones, those cynical employees. They don't trust employers with their personal information. They don't like to share. They think that the policy are not enough, and they really try to avoid any kind of sharing on their personal information in the workplace. And they really hate it when their employer is going to share their data with other third parties. How many do we have of these groups globally? Well, today, complacent employees are about 34%. And if I can tell you from the experience that we have with other segmentations, actually the consumer privacy segmentation, as soon as employees, as consumers, become more aware of their rights, become more aware of the risk, they immediately change that behavior. So that group then today is complacent, you will see over time, will decrease as they become much more familiar with privacy and privacy rights. And I have here for you some more, color about the behavior of these employees. Controller employees are the one that would take measure, as I said, to limit the amount of data that they share with their employer. And also, they are pretty aware of the information that is tracked and processed in the workplace. You see at the very end, the confused employees instead are those that really don't know what is going on with their personal information. This is an interesting data point also to share. We have asked them whether they would like their personal data to be used in workforce analytics projects. Can you see the answers? Now you have the cynical employees, almost 90% says, well, I don't want my data for that. But across all the segments, people want to know, employees want to know if the employer is going to take their data for workforce analytic projects. And another data point there is about the level of comfort with employees sharing, with employers sharing information with third parties. You can see 99% of the cynical employees don't like it. But also the controller one are quite worried about that. And then finally, this is the policies, the privacy policies in the workplace. The cooperative employees, as we said, are those that really think that those are good and those are enough. Before I leave you, after telling you all these things about employee privacy, I will leave you, I want to just share a few recommendations. And I want to start from these complacent employees, right? Those that we said, they don't really take privacy too seriously in the workplace. And I invite everyone to really try and educate them as much as you can about privacy, not just because that is what the regulation is saying and because it's right for them in the employment context. But if you have employees that don't really understand privacy risk, it means that they don't understand privacy risk for consumers either. And so those are extremely, kind of risky employees in the sense that if they generally don't understand what's the risk of personal data and abusing personal data, they might do things to your consumers' data that might be putting the organization in trouble. So educating these employees is very important, not just for privacy and your employee privacy, but for your overall security and privacy posture. And then you have the cooperative ones. So these are employees that trust the employer. They would give you the data if you ask. They think that the policies are right that you have in place. So here really is making sure that you are safeguarding the trust capital that you have built with those employees. So being very clear in the communication, make it in a way that they can clearly understand, and be very empathetic as you do that. And then we have really the controller employees. These understand privacy, understand the requirements, are expecting you to do the right things. They feel that the policies today that they have in the workplace aren't great. So these are the employees that most likely are going to ask you for access, to be forgotten, are going to have questions of what you are doing for privacy. And so these are really the ones that you want to engage because they can become sort of champions for privacy if you manage to persuade them that you are doing the right things for their data. Confused employees, a little bit of the discussion that we have on the complacent one applies to these employees too. Again, those are people that think, if I share data, it's going to be bad, but I don't know what it means, really. I don't know how a risk can actually affect me or what I have to do about it. And so those employees, again, need to be educated for the sake of their privacy, but also for your own security and privacy posture. And then, finally, the cynical employees, again, these are really looking for big programs. And again, those are likely to ask you for data access, data deletion. Those are the ones who are going to be the most difficult to bring on board whenever you run programs or projects that would require additional personal data. And so strong measures have to be in place, and particularly make them understand that they can stay in control, even if they have shared data with you and and they are not obliged to do that. Show them that there are processes and tools in place for them to stay in control. Finally, and we are at the last slide of my 57. Here are some of the next steps that you can take immediately. What are these privacy requirements for employees? Do they apply to your organization? and also start having the conversations. It's not just privacy policies, it's complying with empathy, is making sure that the organizations understand there are expectations, there are attitudes that employees have when it comes to their personal data. And in some organizations, this is really a new conversation that needs to start. And then in the first 3 months, you might want to run some gap analysis to assess where you are with compliance, prioritize the actions that you need to take, and please don't forget my jugular pouch. Start from the definition of what is in scope. Let me go discover that data. Let me go classify that data. And then as you progress, make sure that you are executing on the program, that you find always way to improve and optimize that program. And then gather continuous feedback from your employees. How are you doing? Do they feel comfortable? Do they don't feel comfortable? Do they understand the policies that you're putting into place? Do they understand the processes? Just gather that feedback from them directly. And with this, thank you for spending this time with me. I will be around for the rest of the conference. So if you have any questions about employee privacy, privacy in general, or trust, please let me know and we can chat. Hopefully, I will not have you dialed an incorrect number anymore. So I look forward to the conversations with you. Thank you.